Today I'd like to discuss the paper Effects of Squat Training with Different Depth on Lower Limb Muscle Volume. And this paper was released in June of 2019 and the authors were Kubo et al. Now I've seen this paper passed along on social media as verification and justification for certain ways of training. But there are a lot of limitations to this study and I want to discuss those and discuss why, in my opinion, this paper and the results of this paper actually has no application to anything anybody would do with a client, with a patient, with an athlete, with anybody that they're working with outside of the constraints and the exact constructs of the study itself, using the exact individuals that the study used, okay? So first of all, you can download a free PDF of this study by searching the title online and then searching PDF, and you can find a full copy download of it. So I'm not going to go into the details of the study, but the overarching question that the authors were asking was, which produces greater hypertrophy in the leg muscles? Full squats or half squats? And they went through and defined what they meant by full squat and what they meant by half squat, and they defined which muscles they were looking at. They actually did a nice job of measuring the volumes of the muscles via MRI, and they did a nice job kind of explaining the constructs of the squat and the depth that needed to be hit. But they didn't do a complete job, and that's where a lot of the limitations start to come in. So first of all, let's discuss what would make a study really good, okay? One of the things that make a study really good is that it's able to be reproduced with a bunch of different samples of the targeted population, and you'd get similar results, okay? So there's validity in that where you can repeatedly get the same results, and the study can be performed by a completely different group of researchers with the targeted demographic, and they would see similar results, okay? So one of the things that helps make a study really good is when all the major variables are accounted for. And so in order to do this, we first need to identify, well, what are the different variables that we're talking about for both the exercise and the result, which would be hypertrophy, all right? So what are the things that would influence an exercise and what are the things that would influence hypertrophy? So for an exercise, the different variables that we're looking at is all right, what joint motions are being performed, all right? What are the positions of the other joints that aren't moving while the targeted joints are moving, okay? So for example, if you're doing a biceps curl, you have motion around your elbow, but what's happening at your shoulder, what's happening at your glenohumeral joint? What's happening at your sternoclavicular joint? What's happening at your, all the different segments along your spine? What's happening at your radial ulnar joints, okay? So are you doing more of a neutral grip? Are you doing more of a supinated grip? Are you doing more of a pronated grip? Are your elbows more up? Are they more back? Even though we're doing motion around the elbow for all of those, different grips and different shoulder positions influences the outcome of elbow flexion, okay? So the same holds true for the motion of a squat. So the motion that we're talking, actually what the motion was defined as for the researchers is they were going to measure motion at the knee, okay? They were looking, in order to quantify depth of a squat, they were looking at knee motion with 90 degrees of knee flexion being considered a half squat and 140 degrees of knee flexion being considered a full squat. So knee motion is what we're looking at here. Positions, we then have to consider what's the position of the ankle, what's the position of the hip, what's the position of the trunk. Those are probably the biggest positional things that we need to consider if we're just talking about knee motion being the influence that we are investigating. So we have motions, we have positions. We have what's called the resistance profile. And this is essentially how the challenge changes throughout the range of motion. For example, let's go back to the bicep curl. When the arms are straight down by the side and you're holding dumbbells, the challenge is relatively little relative to when your elbows are flexed to 90 degrees, again, holding dumbbells. This is probably where one of the bigger challenges is, and then up at the top, the challenge is going to be smaller, and down at the bottom, the challenge is going to be smaller. So there's a change in challenge throughout the range of motion, and this is something that you have to understand, that it's a very key component to exercise mechanics, and so the resistance profile, understanding that and what the differences would be between, say, a half squat and a full squat, that's a really big consideration as well. And then the time or the tempo, okay? So time being how long is the entire set lasting, okay? Are you doing 8 reps over the course of 60 seconds? Are you doing 8 reps over the course of 90 seconds? Are you doing 8 reps over the course of 30 seconds? So how long is the set lasting for? And then the tempo of each rep. Are you going down for 3 seconds, pausing for a second, up for 3 seconds, pausing for a second? Are you going down, up, down, up, down, up as fast as you can? Because 8 reps going down, up, down, up, down, up is going to take a lot less time than going down for 3 seconds, pausing for a second, up for 3 seconds, and pausing for a second. So making sure tempo is clearly defined, and then the amount of time that you're doing the exercise is another key variable to consider. And the relative effort or intensity, okay? How hard are you having to work in order to do this exercise? Is this exercise at approximately 50% of your 1 rep max, 90% of your 1 rep max? So understanding the relative effort or intensity of the exercise is another key component. And then finally, this is one that is rarely ever accounted for, but focus, okay? Focus. What's somebody thinking about while they're doing the exercise? Are they doing bicep curls and just thinking about moving the weight up and down? Or are they thinking about squeezing their biceps the whole time? Because that has a drastically different influence on somebody's central nervous system and how they're able to recruit muscle fibers versus just thinking about moving the weight. So the internal focus, that's a really, really big thing that needs to be considered. So all of these are different variables that can influence an exercise and the outcome of an exercise. And so those all need to be taken into consideration whenever we're talking about a study that is using exercise. Now, the other half of the equation was hypertrophy. So we have an exercise and then how much hypertrophy gets created, all right? So what are the different variables that can influence hypertrophy? First is this idea of mechanical stress, or the tissue that you're trying to hypertrophy needs to be challenged directly, all right? Second is time under tension, all right? A longer time under tension, a shorter time under tension. Again, this will influence the amount of hypertrophy that takes place. The effort or the intensity, i.e. the metabolic stress of the exercise, also needs to be considered. And then again, what's somebody thinking about? What are they focusing on? Remember, if you're thinking about squeezing the muscles, that's going to have a different amount of recruitment for muscle fibers than it's just thinking about moving the weight. So that can influence hypertrophy as well. But what the authors wanted to know is whether a change in joint motion is another variable that would add into hypertrophy as well. So what do we have here? We have the question being asked of hypertrophy is motion something that would influence hypertrophy? And we have motion being the variable of exercise that's going to be the one that's looked at. So this means that in an ideal world for this study, every other variable for hypertrophy and for exercise would all remain constant between the two groups, between the full squat and between the half squat. And the only thing that would be different is the motion of the exercise, and then which would give us an answer whether motion is something that influences hypertrophy. So something we can aim for in an ideal study is to have a whole bunch of variables all remaining constant and one variable in flux. And then that one variable can tell us whether or not, or how much influence it has over the question that we're asking, over the thing that we're looking at. So in this case, the one variable that we want in flux would be motion, whether it's 90 degrees of knee flexion or 140 degrees of knee flexion with the bottom position of the squat, and how much influence that has over hypertrophy, okay? But the authors didn't do that, unfortunately, okay? What they did was they did look at motion. So they were really good about this, clearly defining 90 degrees of knee flexion and clearly defining 140 degrees of knee flexion for the half squat and full squat respectively. But what they did not take into consideration was hip position, was ankle position, was trunk position. So all these other positions of the involved joints were not taken in consideration. At least they weren't specified in the paper itself. So that's a big miss. The resistance profile between a half squat and a full squat is drastically different. Because with a half squat, or because how they did a half squat rather, where you're going down to 90 degrees of knee flexion and then coming up, you are spending dramatically less time in the challenging part of the range versus a full squat where you're spending exponentially more time in the challenging part of the range of motion. So this means that somebody that's doing a full squat, just by nature, is going to have more challenge associated with it, regardless of the amount of motion that's taking place. So the resistance profile between the two was not taken in consideration. Additionally, the loads that were used for each were different. And while this is appropriate from an effort and intensity standpoint, this often will change the resistance profile, because as the load on somebody's back changes, their squatting mechanics will likely change. Which means, again, the positions of the hips, of the ankles, and of the trunk are likely going to be different, which is going to create a different resistance profile for the muscles involved. So these two not being accounted for, these have a tremendous influence over the results, and they weren't tightly controlled. So that's a big issue. The time or tempo, this is huge. When we're talking about hypertrophy, time under tension is such a big thing. Now the researchers tried to control it by saying they're going to do 3 sets of 8, but guess what? What they measured was the amount of vertical travel that the bar did. And in the full squat group, there was approximately 70% increase in bar travel versus the half squat group. So if we are going to assume that the half squat group and the full squat group are moving with the same tempo up and down, that means that the full squat group had over a 70% increase in time under tension versus the half squat group. Now a really easy way to control for this is to have the half squat group move slower than the full squat group. And then it doesn't matter how much the bar travels up and down, because the time under tension would be equal then. So this was missed, and they actually, to their credit, they admitted that it was a flaw in the study and at the very end. So I'm glad they acknowledged it, but this is a huge confounding variable that will have a great influence over the results, and that should have been accounted for. The effort and intensity, like I said, they were using 90% of their 1 rep max, each for the half squat and the full squat. So they did a nice job trying to control that variable. But again, with the change in resistance profile based on the load placement and everything like that, half squat versus full squat, it's not exactly a one-to-one trade-off of, well, 90% in the half squat is going to be just as challenging at 90% in the full squat, because where during the range it's its most challenge is going to be different. And so that was attempted, but again, not tightly controlled enough, and then the focus wasn't looked at all. So out of 6 variables that would influence exercise, 1 was variable, and then the rest, the other 5, should have been controlled for. But we had 1 that was variable, 2 variable, 3 variable, 4 variable, 5 kind of nicely done, but not the best, and then 6 not knowing. So out of 1 that should have been the one that they were really looking at, and everything else tightly controlled for, everything was in flux, which means it's really hard to pin the motion as the thing that created the greater results, full squat versus half squat, okay? Now, looking at the case for hypertrophy, again, mechanical stress, challenging the tissue directly, this is going to be a combination of the positions, of the resistance profile, and of the motions that are taking place. Well, if these aren't controlled for, that's not going to be controlled for. Time under tension, again, wasn't controlled for here, means it's not going to be controlled for there. Effort and intensity, tried to be controlled for in both, but again, because of the challenge actually being a mix of not only the load, but the mechanics as well, then because the mechanics weren't tightly controlled for, the effort and intensity is not going to be tightly controlled for. Focus, again, not looking at it at all, and the question being, well, does motion have an influence over hypertrophy? So what the researchers found is that the people that did the full squat for 10 weeks, 2 days a week, 3 sets of 8 reps, had more hypertrophy in their glutes and more hypertrophy in their adductor muscles than those who did a half squat, all right? The challenge with then taking that conclusion and applying it to any scenario is you can't recreate all the different things that weren't accounted for. If the one thing you're trying to recreate is the amount of motion, you can do that, but you're not able to recreate the positions. You're not able to recreate the resistance profile or the tempo. You can kind of recreate the effort intensity. You're not able to recreate the focus because none of those things were controlled for. So it's not that the results that were found were invalid, but the conclusions that were drawn do not explain the results because of the number of variables that were not controlled for during this study. So anytime you read a study on exercise, you need to understand what are the different variables that could come into play, which ones are being controlled for, and which ones are being in question, all right? And in this paper, they tried to pose a question about the motion and the motion only, but all the other variables really were not controlled for at all, which means the results, they just don't have application to anything outside of that one specific scenario with that one demographic of individuals who are doing the half squat and who are doing the full squat, okay? So look this paper up online. You can get all the details about the paper. You can find a full PDF of it. But this is my 2 cents on this paper, and the intentions behind it were fantastic, but the experimental design was not. And that's where the issues arise, that's where the flaws come in, and that's why there's really no application of this paper to anything anybody would do with any person.